Hi everyone, Alan Knight here with Night Talk, and today I'm very excited about my guest. Her name is Elizabeth Yarnell, and I'm not going to say too much about her other than she's a fascinating woman who's done a lot of amazing work, continues to do amazing work in the area of health and wellness, and specifically anti-inflammatory diseases and so on. We'll get more into that a little later, but at the very top, I just want to introduce you, Elizabeth. I was going to say Yarnell. I won't call you Yarnell. Elizabeth,
Okay.
welcome.
Thank you, Alan. I'm so glad to be here.
Boy, you have a lot of stuff in your background there.
You know, I had to reorient my desk recently because I broke my foot and I couldn't get around to the way my desk was. And so, yes, right now it does seem like I have a lot in my background.
So the health and fitness guru broke her foot.
I know. I was walking the dog and I was trying to social distance and get off the sidewalk when a group of little girls was coming toward me, and I didn't realize the dog did not choose to follow me.
Oh, so at what stage of the healing are you?
I think I'm about 3 weeks in, and I have a big old space age boot on my foot, and it's actually, I feel like I'm doing really, really well and moving forward with this. It's probably, this is my third bone I've broken in my life, the second one in the last 14 months, and
Yeah.
this one is healing the quickest. Thank you.
Wonderful. So it kind of fits with the COVID lifestyle anyway.
You know, if of all times to break a foot and not be able to drive anywhere or really walk many places, this is a good time to do it.
Wonderful. So before we get into, as I said to you when I was talking to you the other day and inviting you to do an interview, I said I want to keep these talks as personal as I can. And obviously, toward the end of this brief session, we'll get more into what you do. But I'm more interested in knowing more about you, the person. So why don't we start in a general way? Give us an overview, a little bit about your background, a little bit about yourself, so that we get some context and we'll go from there.
Okay, so I started off my career in the film and video industry in 1988, and I worked in film and video for about a decade. And I also, during that time, transitioned to become an instructional designer. And then, so this was early in the 90s when technologies were emerging, and I became a multimedia instructional designer, which was brand new at the time. This was moving from designing training courses for big corporations. I did mostly telecoms like Lucent Technologies and AT&T. And so before this, we would design programs that would be led by somebody standing at the front of a room and teaching people how to do something. But when I came into the scene, it was the emergence of new technologies of the internet and CD-ROMs. And so I really focused on multimedia instructional design.
Mm-hmm.
And I was doing that for about a decade. And then all sorts of things happened. One was the tech bubble burst, and so a lot of my clients dried up. And the second one was that I went to sleep one night as usual when I was 2 weeks before my 30th birthday, and I awoke the next morning blind in my right eye.
Oh my.
And it turned out I had multiple sclerosis.
Wow.
So that made a huge, sharp turn in my life and my career. And I became very focused on how I could make my future better, because I learned that 80% of MS patients experience significant disability within 10 years of diagnosis. So I was learning that I was about to turn 30 years old, but by the time I turned 40, I might be in a wheelchair.
Wow. Wow.
So that's when I started learning about health and natural health, and really focusing on how can I change the course of this disease so that I don't end up in a wheelchair.
Okay, just before you go on, take us through the initial stages once you were diagnosed and you knew that there was something wrong. How quickly were you diagnosed with MS, and what were some of the emotions, feelings, reactions you had, and how long did they last for?
Good questions. In a lot of ways, I was very fortunate because a lot of people who have autoimmune issues spend years sometimes trying to get a diagnosis for their disease. But as it turns out, my father is a neurologist. And so as soon as that day when I awoke and I was having trouble seeing and I couldn't figure out why I couldn't read, I kept looking, is there something in my eye that's blocking my vision? I couldn't figure it out. And my father happened to call me that morning and he's like, what's going on? I'm like, well, I think I need to go see an eye doctor. And he said, well, what's going on? And I told him, and he said, I'll call you right back. And he calls me right back. And he said, I just made an appointment for you with an eye doctor downtown. You need to be there in an hour. And I was like, oh, okay. And so I went to this appointment and the eye doctor looked at my eye and he said, I think you have optic neuritis, which is swelling of the optic nerve. And he said, there's not really a lot we can do for it. It's just a swelling. And so while I was in the office, we talked to my father and he gave my father this diagnosis. And my father said, you need to come right now to the hospital where I work and we're going to put you in for an MRI of your brain. I think he had a little suspicion that there was something going on. And so I went in for the MRI. It was a very, the whole day is kind of a blur because it just all started happening so fast. And I went into the MRI and I came out, and in the radiology reading room, there was my entire family, my mom and my dad and my stepmom and my stepdad and my aunt. And they were all looking, the walls were plastered with these black and white images of my brain.
Wow.
And my father went up to the images and said, here's a scar, here's a scar, here's a scar. There were 17 scars on my brain. And he said, you have multiple sclerosis.
Wow. So what was your initial reaction, your feelings over the next 24 hours and beyond?
Well, the first thing I did was I asked my dad, I said, does this mean I'm going to be one of Jerry's kids? And he said, no, that's muscular dystrophy, not multiple sclerosis.
Jerry Lewis, yeah.
He said, that's something you have to be born with. This is an autoimmune degenerative nervous system disease that you develop. And we don't know why it happens, and we don't know how to stop it. And what we do know is that MS patients go in a fairly predictable course, which is this downhill slope where they just continue to become more and more disabled and lose more and more functionality until they reach the bottom and end up very disabled and die shortly after that. In the beginning, I feel there was a lot of shock and disbelief because I didn't feel like I had been unhealthy. I had been a girl on the go and moving forward with my career. I had just met the man of my dreams on a chairlift, and
wow.
We had gotten engaged. We had spent the summer in the Far East, in Hong Kong and in China and Tibet. And I had to go home. First, I had to call my fiance who lived in Steamboat Springs. So he had to jump in his car and drive 4 hours to come and be with me. And then the more that I learned about multiple sclerosis, I really had to ask him and tell him and say, I know that when we met and when you proposed to me, this wasn't what you signed up for. And if you want to step out now, then now is the time to do that. And it would be okay.
You actually said that. And what was his response?
I'm going to cry. He said,
is it okay that I ask you that?
Yes.
Okay.
He said, you're the one for me. And it doesn't matter if you're in a wheelchair or not, you're still the one.
Wow. That's unconditional love, my dear.
Yes.
Just think of how few people have that level of acceptance and love in their life.
Yes.
You're an example of my soulmate revolution.
And I honestly am, because as I said, I met my husband on a chairlift. We had our first date 2 weeks later. We didn't live in the same city. We had our first date 2 weeks later, and our second date, I think was it on our first date or our second date, which was a couple weeks after that, he asked me, he said, well, what are you doing for the summer because he was a school teacher, and we met on April Fool's Day. And I said, well, I'm going to go on this 2-week horseback trip across the Eastern Tibetan Plateau. What are you doing? And he said, well, if I have to go halfway around the world to be with you, then I guess that's what I'm doing.
Wow. Now, I know this is off topic a bit, but is your husband, I'm assuming you're together, right?
We are 21 years now.
When my course comes out in the end of August on the Soulmate Revolution, one of the things I want to do is I want to interview, it's not just about, it's about helping people attract their soulmates, but what I want to do is interview people that are already together and have been soulmates for a while to get some of their stories. So would you and your husband be open to that?
I would be. He's a little more camera shy than I am.
Oh, we'll get him on. He's got to learn to overcome that. He's got to learn.
Yes. So, yeah, I even have some great pictures. I think I have one right here. Give me half a second.
Sure, sure.
Oh, there it is. I have to disconnect to grab it.
Ladies and gentlemen, we're just about to see an example of true soulmates, unconditional love.
Okay, so this is a picture of us on horseback in Tibet.
Wow. Did you go to any monasteries?
We did. In fact, we got engaged right above the monastery at Lama Su.
Oh, wow. You know, I told you I was a Zen monk for 9 years. And and Tibetan Buddhism was a big part of my background too. Now, let's go back just before we leave that topic of how you felt. There was shock. Obviously, there was shock. How long would you say did you stay in a, I don't want to call it a negative state, but in a state of being a little bit down, a little depressed, a little bit overwhelmed? How long did that last?
So the first thing I did was really hole up in my apartment with my computer and tried to learn everything I could about what MS was. I really hadn't heard about it. I only knew one person in my life before this who had MS. She was the wife of the camp director that I went to for about 10 years when I was a kid. And I didn't really know what it meant. And the MS doctors basically said, here are your options. You can take one of these injectable disease-modifying therapies, which have terrible side effects, but it's the best that we know of, and it may help you stay healthier or more active, more mobile, more functional longer, or it may not. Really, they didn't have very good results. But basically, the advice for MS patients was to go home and kind of take it easy, which really didn't work for me because I didn't want to sit around and wait for my body to disintegrate on me. And as I said, I'd met my husband on a chairlift. We were skiing. That was the big part of the future we had envisioned for ourselves. I don't know if I ever sunk into a huge depression. It was more of a desperate fact-finding mission. And it was my fiance at the time who suggested that it might have something to do with what I had been eating. And
so what I hear you saying is that it wasn't so much like you had one moment that said, okay, I'm fed up, I'm going to do something about it. It was a gradual awareness that this is the reality, this is the diagnosis. What can I actually do to move forward? And
yes.
And obviously, I guess a big turning point was that you, at some point during that process, you probably felt, hey, maybe there's something that I can actually do about it, as opposed to just accept the medical model of how I'm going to respond to it. Was that the case?
Yes.
Okay, good. So that led you to the path of exploring your diet, what you were eating, and your overall health, right?
Yes.
And what did you come to learn? Just to keep it, I know we can go on for hours talking about all, but just to keep it brief, what did you start to learn about nutrition and how that might be impacting your condition?
Well, I really started to learn how complex the human body is. We are really this amazing machine, and we are electrical and chemical. And for all of these things to happen so that we can see and we can talk and we can hear and we can eat and we can move. There's so many processes that happen, I should say, behind the scenes inside the body so that all these things can happen. And we need to have very specific balances and levels of nutrients and vitamins and minerals and neurotransmitters. All these things have to be present in order for everything to function. So the first thing I learned was that when you have a diet full of processed foods the way that I had, that there can be deficiencies and toxins that are blocking those kinds of activities from happening. And so I realized that I wasn't eating a nutrient-dense diet. In fact, my diet was pretty much made up of fast food or restaurant food or restaurant leftovers, or I just skipped the meal. I was a girl living on my own for the whole decade of my 20s. The only staple foods I kept in my apartment were Crystal Light, Diet Coke, and gummy bears.
Wow. That's amazing.
So I was learning that there were all of these toxins that were in our food supply, all these chemicals and additives and preservatives that could also be causing problems. So there were these two things that I became very interested in. One was these toxins and chemicals and preservatives and things that were in all of our foods. And if you start to read labels, you see them everywhere. But also the second part was that we need to have a balance of minerals and nutrients in order for everything to work, for the neurotransmitters to go through, for the synapses, for the nerves to transmit, for all of these functions. We still don't even really understand how some of our senses work. Like we pretty much understand how we see. We have rods and cones. We don't really understand how we smell. There's a lot of different conflicting theories about that. So the human body is just a really amazing machine. And
So I want to bring up a point that I often talk about when I'm talking to experts on the area of nutrition and diet. And I relate a little bit to your experience. I told you before, about 8 years ago, I was diagnosed with Parkinson's. And increasingly, I'm managing it. There's a lot of aspects that have gotten a lot better. If I would have been talking to you two years ago or a year and a half ago, I'd be tremoring a lot more. Now, I'm sure you'll agree that the physical aspect is not the only aspect. There's an emotional aspect too. So I know in my case, what I do with my emotions, my mind, my spirit is crucial. Then there's also the nutrition. There's also the physical exercise. I'll give you a very quick example because I want to bring it back to to what you're talking about. There's a guy that was diagnosed with Parkinson's many years ago, couldn't walk, needed a walker, could hardly walk. And someone told him, you should be getting up and walking more forcefully. He had a kind of more rigidity-based Parkinson as opposed to tremor-based. And he started walking every day, picking up the speed. And in time, he eliminated most of his Parkinsonian symptoms. Now, I noticed that with me, most of what happened is on the right side, my arm and my hand. But a little bit started about a year or two ago in my foot, my right foot being numb. And it was getting a little bit worse. And recently I said, I sense intuitively that I haven't been walking and exercising really intensively. I'm kind of lazy in my walk. So I started walking and doing what he did, and my whole energy has shifted in my leg. The reason I'm bringing this up is, how do we know, even if someone eats really well, but they're not dealing with their emotional side, isn't that going to have an impact on their body?
So I think what you're really talking about is neuroplasticity. And our brain can rewire itself and find ways to work around it. And yes, I think the emotions have a lot to do with that. I also think the emotions are connected to the inflammation in our body. So in my work, what I've really come to focus on is inflammation as the root of all of these issues. And what I have found is not only does inflammation affect your physical abilities and your sense of pain and discomfort, but also your emotional state. And you can create anxiety attacks with inflammation. You can create depression with inflammation. You can create all kinds of foggy thinking that have to do with inflammation. I think even things like schizophrenia has to do with inflammation.
But when you analyze a potential client of yours, do you first go into depth to see whether inflammation is the real issue? And do you sometimes find that inflammation is either part the issue or not an issue at all?
I would say I find almost 100% that inflammation is at the root of their problems.
Is that right? So would you say in 100% of the cases, nutrition is going to be a big part of the solution?
So we call it nutrition, but really what I think it is finding the foods that your body tolerates correctly. So that's really called more food sensitivities or hypersensitivity reactions.
Right.
So, yes.
How long did it take for you from the time that you were diagnosed with MS to actually change your career toward this process of inflammatory diseases?
So I was diagnosed with MS in 1999, and I started studying nutrition, right, it was January 1999. So almost immediately I started focusing on nutrition and food and eating, but I realized very quickly that I didn't know how to cook and I didn't really understand what a healthy diet was. In fact, even my MS doctors would say, well, yeah, sure, everybody should have a healthy diet, but who knows what that is? And at the time, a healthy diet was like no carbs and diet sodas instead of regular soda. I mean, just really what I consider ridiculous information now. So I started studying, and everything that I was learning really was pointing back to that whole foods were better than processed foods. And I thought, okay, well, that makes sense because it's the processed foods that have all these chemicals and all these toxins in it. So I started learning how to cook. I started taking cooking classes and watching the Food Network. And then, but I was quickly realizing that cooking from whole foods, even though I was starting to feel better, was just incredibly time consuming, and fatigue is a hallmark of MS. So that was really tough. And then one day I became what I call an accidental inventor. And I went to my oven and I pulled out a cast iron Dutch oven and I put a whole bunch of whole foods in it. And I cranked up my oven to 450 degrees and put everything in. And about half an hour dinner was ready. And so that really improved the way that I was feeling, because now I was doing this all the time and I was cooking these great whole foods. And I didn't really think that much about it until my college roommate came to visit. And at the end of the week, she asked me, can you please teach me how to cook like you do? And I said, well, you've seen what I do. I literally just put everything into a cast iron Dutch oven like this one, throw it into my oven at a super high heat and cook it. And she said, I think there's a little bit more to it than that. And so I sat down and I wrote out a cookbook, or what I consider to be an instructional manual. And then I spent the next 5 years trying to get my cookbook an agent and a publisher. And in the meantime, I was teaching cooking classes and doing demonstrations at health fairs and all kinds of random places. Anywhere anybody would let me do a cooking demonstration, I did a ton at like cookware stores. And then in 2005, I decided that I wasn't going to wait anymore for an agent or publisher, who had all sent me back very nice letters saying, this is a great manuscript, but nobody's going to buy a cookbook from a nobody. And I went ahead and self-published. It turned out to be a great solution. So in the first month of my publication of my cookbook, I sold out the entire first print run of 2,000 copies. I got a ton of press, won a bunch of awards. I was on the local bestsellers list for several months. So that kind of became my full-time job. And that I was really feeling so much better. And I toured the whole country with my cookbook and doing cooking demonstrations and preaching that whole foods are better than processed foods. So that's really, I guess I started feeling better. I was diagnosed in 1999. My last serious MS exacerbation was in 2002.
How, before we kind of wrap up with letting people know how to get in touch with you, because obviously you help a lot of people, couple of questions. You told me that most of your eyesight has returned. Now, at what point did you actually feel or see tangible evidence of your eyesight coming back? And how long did it take to get to where it is now?
So when I woke up that morning, I really couldn't see anything out of that eye. And in fact, it was just white. I always thought that if you couldn't see, it would be black. It was white. It was like looking at a white wall. And my other eye was having trouble too. And in fact, I couldn't read. And that was the scariest part, was that here I was a writer and a reader my whole life. And I couldn't process what I was reading. I mean, I could like kind of see the words, but it didn't make any sense to me. I had no reading comprehension. And that was the scariest part for me. What am I going to do if I can't read? If I can't use my eyes to see and read and write? That I didn't even know what I would do. My whole career is based on reading and writing. So for the first couple months, I couldn't drive. I had to get rides everywhere. And then it gradually returned to the point where I could drive after maybe 2 or 3 months. Mm-hmm. And by the next season, I was skiing tentatively. It was tough to ski. I still don't like to ski on days when there's flat light, because you need both eyes to have depth perception. And so my depth perception is not as great as it once was, but it's really good now. It's my eye doctor says I have 93% of my vision back.
Wow, good for you. Now, when people come to see you, they obviously go through a process. You do an evaluation, you do an assessment. How long have you been actually coaching people? And leave us with, in a kind of a minute or so, your favorite story. I'm sure you've helped a lot of people in a lot of ways, but give us one story of how you helped transform one of your patients or one of your clients.
This is a story I love. This was a 15-year-old girl who came to me after being diagnosed with an autoimmune issue. She was struggling so hard. She had dropped out of school. Her parents were homeschooling her. She's an only child. Her doctor had referred her to a nutritionist who had put her on a paleo diet. And she was just getting worse and worse and worse, only 15 years old. She came to me. We did food sensitivity testing. It turned out that she was hypersensitive to almost every protein, almost every meat-based animal protein. So that was why she was going downhill. We completely reversed her diet based on the scientific food sensitivity testing, and put her more on a grain-based and non-meat-based diet. She started to recover. She went on to graduate as valedictorian of her high school.
Wow, isn't that fantastic? So good for you, congratulations. When people contact you, could you, in 30 seconds, tell us what's the process they go through? Once you speak with them, do you do some kind of consultation or evaluation or assessment?
Yep, we do. Our first session is a full health assessment, and we determine, are you a good candidate to work with me? Is inflammation at the root of your problems? Mm-hmm. Because if it is, then I can work with inflammation. I don't care what your diagnosis is. I don't care where it's manifesting in your body. If it's inflammation, that's what I can work with. And we just work on removing, it's really a windshield wiper approach, where we just remove any extraneous inflammation that's going on in your body. And then we see what's left that we need to address.
Fantastic. So for people to get in touch with you, what's the best way to do that?
So you can always reach me through my website at elizabethyarnell.com. And my clinic is open to patients nationwide. So if any of your patients would like to book a free complimentary natural health assessment to see if they're a good candidate to work with me, they can go directly to bit.ly/EY assessment.
Wonderful. Well, it's really wonderful having you. I hope that you stay in touch with us, and anytime you have new testimonials, send them along, and I'm happy to post them. We could go on for hours talking about your story. It's very interesting, but congratulations. Say hello to your husband. We'll get the two of you on the Soulmate Revolution, and thanks for being on.
Well, thank you so much, Ellen. And yeah, I would love to be on the Soulmate Revolution with you. So I'm so glad to have done this today. Thank you.
Thank you. And take care, everyone. We'll talk to you soon.